All right. So we are going to start exporting everything to ZBrush. Just made a 2ZBrush folder in my data directory. And pretty simple. Just going to export them one at a time. As I export them, just give them a name. And there you go. Almost done. And then we're going to jump into ZBrush. All right. So now in ZBrush, I need to assemble my Z tool. And so for this, I'm just going to import the OBJs that I exported from Maya. So just going to import them one at a time. And then I can append them all to a single tool. So there's this annoying thing in ZBrush 3.5 that it doesn't remember the last directory you were in. So every time I hit that import button, I have to navigate back to where my stuff is. So if anybody knows how to fix that, let me know. It's really annoying. Okay. So now, got them all imported. Just going to append them all. All right. And then now, my Z tool is made. Let's jump in edit mode, and there it is. So everything looks okay. So I'm just going to save it out, make a ZBrush folder in my project directory. Save my Z tool. And then at this point, I'm just going to go in the geometry palette and just subdivide a bunch of these subtools just to smooth things out. And just further making sure that everything's working. And then there we go. So clearly a lot of sculpting ahead of us. Save it out one more time. And then I initialized ZBrush. That's why the background changed, that gradient. And then dragged the Z tool back in. And now with the torso, just starting to sculpt. So I've got about 2 hours of the ZBrush sculpting after time-lapsing it. And we're not going to go and watch all 2 hours of that. The footage we're looking at right now is time-lapsed at 10 times real time. So like, 10 hours of sculpting would become 1 hour. So I've got a couple hours, which also includes some non-ZBrush stuff in Photoshop and Maya that we're going to get to later. But so meaning that I probably spent about 16 hours or 17 hours in ZBrush on this guy. And but the thing is that it's going to get, repetitive after a little while. And so we're not going to watch all of the 2 hours of what I have. We'll see how much we can bear, and then I'll sort of probably start jumping around. But I'll let it play for a little bit, just so that I can talk about some of the basic stuff that I do in ZBrush. So earlier you saw I was using the clay brush, but I primarily use the clay tubes brush, which is what I'm using right now. I use that probably 95% of the time. Clay tubes, and then the move tool, and standard brush, and the pinch brush, but I don't really use much else. There's a lot of really cool brushes in ZBrush, definitely also some new ones in 3.5 that I haven't had the time yet to experiment with. So, but as far as clay tubes go, I really, really love this brush for a variety of reasons. There's something about it that I just think feels very naturally for building up form. And I actually really like the texture it leaves behind. And so it's sort of a good placeholder for, the final real textures you would make for something. But it still just has a an interesting feel to it that I like. So with what I'm doing with the clay tubes brush, a lot of the process of what I'm going through, as you can see right now, is more similar to drawing than it is to sculpture. Um, and so, in my opinion, just because I'm having to go through and create a map for the sculpting I'm going to do, and so I just have to go and sort of draw these lines in to then sort of dictate where I'm going to have to build up the form. Some of the lines I put in, like the ones I just did, are based on the design that I did in Photoshop earlier. And so something that I'm going to try and do is match that obviously as closely as I can. While when I'm in certain areas like the top of the head or the back or the front that are not visible in the design, then I have to invent that. And so a big part of what I'm doing in ZBrush is design. And so where I have to sort of resolve how these forms translate from the side view into a 3/4, into the top view, and through that process trying to add details that are interesting, fit with the overall sort of design and vibe of the creature guy, and also trying to avoid areas being too flat or too smooth or too boring. So something like his head, which is relatively large, has a lot, to start out with, lots of large flat areas. And so I'm just trying to add some information in there. So here I'm just masking, so I can then jump to the move tool and just push in that area. So this guy obviously doesn't have any eyes or a mouth, but he does have this sort of sensory duct membrane thing, which is something that will need to be resolved later as far as if it has any function or what the function's for, but that's his main sensory intake for his head. So a lot of what I'm doing with the move tool, by the way, I work with 2 monitors like a lot of people do, and so while I'm sculpting on one monitor on my Cintiq, which this is the first sculpt I've ever done on a Cintiq, which was really rad, cool and fun. But on my other monitor, I have the design up, just so that as I'm sculpting, I can always be referring to that just to make sure that whatever landmarks may be in that design, I maintain. And then, but there's a lot of filling in the gaps. And so a lot of this moving that I'm doing inside there is based on looking at the design on another monitor and making those adjustments. So it's, it's possible that it would be helpful, for you to have that design up as well while you're watching this, just to see what I'm looking at on another screen. Which would be easy for you to grab from the earlier lectures. Just do a screen grab of, the design. Or maybe I'll just put it up online so it's easier for you to grab. So in this area, in general, the nice thing, since the topology I did in Maya, since I spent so much time on that, my model as I have it subdivided in ZBrush has most of the information as far as general guidelines of what I'm supposed to do without having to look at the design all the time. Because if I hadn't done an ordered base mesh, I just did like a 20-minute box model blob thing and went into ZBrush, I'd have to look at that design all the time. And so with having this ordered base mesh, I'm really not referring to the design that much. It's like when I get into certain areas, I'll sort of glance at it. It's definitely not something that I'm constantly having to stare at, which means I can focus on ZBrush. And that process can be a little more fun when you're in a situation where you have to like try and match a design perfectly, which my intention with this project was to, do a design, pick a design, and then really stick to that and try and have my Z-sculpt be as good of an interpretation as I can do of that 2D drawing. So that the sculpt in the end really does feel like, like the design that's implied by that simple sketch. Hopefully I pulled it off. So you can see I'm sort of jumping around different parts of the head, just trying to very slowly build up the forms inside here. My intention though is definitely not to try and completely resolve and finish any of the areas that I'm working on. And so I'm sort of blocking things out, but I'm definitely not trying to bring them to finish. That's I don't want to spend too much time on one area. And so here's an important part of the face. We're going to see this guy from the front at some point, so I just want the front of his face or snout not to be totally flat, so I'm trying to add some interesting flow or rhythm from the side of the head into the front there. Just adding a little bit more thickness to that jawline. Zbrush is thinking about something. Okay, there we go. But yeah, while I've worked on the head now for a little bit, we can see resolving the top of the head with things that are obviously not in the design. So everything I'm doing right now is just adding, so if we look at this ridge that's on the side of the head right there, look up here, that little ridge was not in the design, just trying to add things that might make it more interesting. But moving on, now into the torso. Obviously, the design from the side showed this thing, sort of protruding from the front of his chest. So I always kind of assumed that was just his sternum sticking out, not his actual chest muscles. So just starting to block this stuff in. So, like I was mentioning earlier, while I didn't completely bring the head to finish, I've kind of blocked it out. It's important to move around on your model just to work it as a whole, because if you noodle one area too much and then run out of time later, that area being more worked than everything else might stand out. You have to be careful of sort of time management. And so by jumping around and sort of allowing the form of the whole thing to come together might make things a little bit more cohesive. So here's an important thing that I'm doing now, which is another area that was not at all in the design. Couldn't see what was going on in the front of his chest or abdomen in the side view drawing. So now I'm basically continuing the design process and inventing what it could look like from the front and side here. So trying to resolve, starting obviously with just the obvious, a rib cage and abdominal muscles and oblique muscles, and then trying to have that general map that I just draw in with the clay tubes brush, and then now starting to take it and tweak it a little bit. Because while human anatomy is the obvious basis for the general flow of the guy, I don't want it to be literal. And so I'll start with my basic map that implies where things should kind of connect, but then start tweaking it so that it feels a little weird. And this is the process that I think is really the most fun. Because human anatomy in and of itself is an important foundational thing to understand as well as you can, which, in the end takes a really, really long time to absorb. And it's something that I definitely haven't mastered yet. I don't know if I ever will, but I've studied it. I've studied it a lot in art school, and just drawing and doing stuff over the years. But then your knowledge that you gain by studying anatomy and doing figure drawing and all that kind of stuff then becomes a basis that you can then play with, which is something that I really enjoy the most, which is why I'm kind of into creature stuff as opposed to, let's say, doing, photoreal humans. Because in the end, I don't really want to just copy the real world. I think it's more fun to make stuff up. And so in here, the process of being able to sort of come up with different shapes or forms inside there for his body as a whole as we go through it is really what I find to be, for me, rewarding creatively. Because when I was in art school at Art Center studying illustration, the illustration program there was pretty much all figure drawing. And so, I spent a good solid couple of years just figure drawing all the time from a model or, doing master studies, and it's just figure drawing, figure drawing, figure drawing, figure painting, all the time. And it was kind of mind numbing. I actually didn't really like it very much because in the end I wanted to do creative stuff, inventive stuff from the imagination, and we didn't really get to do much of that. And so at the time I really was kind of a little bit bitter about it, but I went through it. And while it was a little bit boring to me, I still learned a lot. Not, only, it was only, art school is a very short period of time in relation to your life. So you learn only so much. It really just gives you a start point. That's something that I always tell people or students at Gnomon is that, their experience going even through our full-time program at Gnomon is just the beginning of a lifelong pursuit of, trying to improve, trying to learn more, trying to improve your skill at your craft, which takes, really, you'll never learn everything that you want to learn. And so the experience that I went through at Art Center for those, couple of years of figure drawing, and all the years I had before that of drawing lots of superheroes and comic books and stuff like that, gives me a foundation of anatomy, but definitely not a thorough, anatomically correct in every way understanding of anatomy. I definitely don't have that. So, which if I was doing photoreal humans would be more important. But for creature stuff, I can get away with having sort of a basic understanding of anatomy, and then having the gaps in my knowledge on some hand create a certain style that may come across. And so style on one level could be defined by, your lack of knowledge coming through. But at the same time, by understanding the logic of anatomy, of, the skeleton and muscles and tendons and fat and how things function and what muscles do, by understanding the logic of it, of how the human body works on some level, you can then sort of try to make up your own logic when you're laying out anatomy, which for creature stuff is a good thing to do, because if it really looks perfectly human, I find that to be a little less interesting for something like a creature. And so I think it's more interesting where you see weird anatomy. And when you see, certain people that are amazingly talented at that, inventing anatomy, people like Carlos Fuente or Simon Beasley, or, there's certain artists out there that are really, really good at it because they have, in the end, a very thorough knowledge of human anatomy or animal anatomy and insects to deep sea creatures to whatever. It's like the more you understand and know and absorb about nature and the structures of life that exist, then the more you can sort of recombine those in weird ways. And that's, you see a lot of that in Carlos's work, and his stuff is so cool. And then Simon Beasley is another person who when it had a pretty profound effect on me wanting to be able to do kind of weird inventive anatomy. Back when I was like, 20 or 21, and went on this art trip to London. A friend of mine's dad organized this trip because he was teaching at Otis. And we went to London and went to a bunch of museums and whatever. But then we also went to this, the highlight of the trip wasn't all the museums and stuff for me. It was this trip to Forbidden Planet, which was this fantasy art bookstore. And I discovered 2008 ebooks, and Simon Beasley's Slain which I think is pronounced differently than that, but I've always just pronounced it that way. It's about this sort of like Norse berserker warrior crazy dude who, when he gets into berserker mode, his anatomy just tweaks out and he gets all, his muscles just start bulging in these bizarre ways. And it's really just rather amazing, really cool, inventive anatomy. And that's something that struck me as just really wanting to be able to do that. So this clip just ended. So we just made it through the first of about 5 time-lapse recordings of ZBrush. And so let's just pause for a second and move on to the next one. Okay. So, yeah, so I was talking about Simon Beasley. But just in the end, my point being that inventive anatomy is something that I think is just really, really fun, and something that I just want to continue to try and get better at, because I just think that for me, I'm not somebody who has much interest in, going outside and doing plein air painting or doing, alla prima paintings from life, or, I just, doing drawings and paintings from what's in front of me is not my thing. I mean, I definitely really appreciate it for people that other people that do it, but for myself, I just get bored quickly doing that kind of stuff. And so for me, I'm much more interested in making stuff up. And for me, that was definitely a good part of why I left Art Center. I was there for 2 years and then got really into the 3D thing. And in the end, I just wanted to do that. I just wanted to make my own stuff. I just got tired of just sitting and being told to do still lifes and just draw from the model. There came a certain point that I wanted to take what I was learning from that and apply it to something inventive. And I got lucky and got a cool job, so it worked out. But the thing is that for what I'm doing in here right now, it's obviously based on human anatomy in there, but on some hand, it's a little bit different. And so, but also hopefully has some feeling of logic, like the form and the shape of things is different. Obviously if we're looking at the back where his spine and vertebrae and, that 7th vertebrae that sort of sticks out at the back in your trapezius, would be, his is all whacked out and larger and inflated and bloated and bigger and compressed. But hopefully there's still some feeling of, logic to musculature inside there that could maybe work. That's the fun thing, I think, to try and figure out with creature stuff. And so just trying to slowly figure this stuff out. But yeah, with one thing that's also definitely true with me is that it's been a little bit, it's been a while since I've done things like figure drawing and stuff, and I should really get back into it. It's when I see somebody like Ryan Kingsland, who's so dedicated to studying the human figure and anatomy all the time, and there's definitely things that I do that create a certain style in the stuff that I do, but that style, is it intentional, or is it just coming from holes in my knowledge? And I think a lot of my style would come from that, which means that there's really a lot more studying to do so that things feel a little bit more intentional or more anatomically logical, even though it might be inventive. Because, Carlos, who's amazing at doing this kind of stuff, Carlos Huante, Obviously has been doing it, every day for many, many, many years. He's got a pretty cool job as far as being able to design creatures all the time, and therefore he's, a billion times better than me because he has, practiced this art form so much. And when you look at his work and just the bizarre combinations of anatomy that are clearly coming not just from humans, but from humans and insects and, all sorts of different types of or examples of life that are being recombined in his work. That inventive recombination that he does is something that he's not only a master of recombining it, but a master of rendering it. And I just think that's so cool. And so it's, in the end, though, something that I also will do, while I'm doing something like this sculpt, not so much on this one, but on other ones, is that, while you're working, whenever that there's an area that, sometimes I'll feel that my knowledge of an area is, good enough that I can invent what it needs to look like. Other times I might feel that my knowledge is actually sort of lacking some critical information, and then obviously I'll just look at reference, things like the, Écorché mail from Anatomy Tools, which, everybody seems to have, which if you don't, you should, because it's amazingly well done and super useful. And, being able to have, reference so that if there is something you're like, okay, well, this I'm actually not even sure of, so I need to go and look at something. I'm sure I'm not the only person who's going to be, mentioning reference material. So what I just am doing in there, a very common thing in ZBrush is to, sorry that I might be rambling a lot. It's 3 in the morning and my computer's been crashing like crazy. For some weird reason, my FireWire card, I think, is jacked, and therefore it's been an interesting experience trying to get this to allow me to record this masterclass. So I'm a little groggy. Hence, I'm now rambling again about being groggy. But I was talking about in ZBrush how it's very common that I have to switch to a lower subdivision level to smooth things out. Just because when you have something that's box modeled as your base mesh, you're going to end up having certain areas that have like a crisp edge to them when you smooth it. And to soften that out, it's a lot easier to do it at lower subdivision levels. So you'll see me do that a bit. Also, we can see that I'm jumping around a bit from one area to another. Sometimes if I get, work on a certain area, I might get bored of that area and move along to something else. Or I might hit an area that's kind of tricky to resolve and then, again, move on. Or while I'm working on one area, I might see something on another part that I feel like working on. So jumping around. And definitely saving a lot. So if we look up here, we can see that we're on our 8th save. So basically every hour or so I tend to save, and then I save it with a new number. You can see that I also occasionally mask things out. There you can see I went to a lower estiv level just to smooth out that sort of ridge we were getting from our base mesh. And then as I move from the outside of the forearm, which is in the design, to the inside, I get back into having to sort of design something that makes sense, but at the same time is not identical to what's on the outside, just because it's on the, what's in the design is one thing, but anything that's missing still needs to feel like it's part of the same design. And then for this guy with his forearm, I definitely did not want to go and try to make it human as far as where all the muscles are and the muscle groups and the flexors and extensors and how they connect to each other. And because this guy has this huge sort of, bony armadillo shell sort of thing on his forearm, and therefore the function of how his forearm might work, how it might bend and what it might do, has no definitive relation to human anatomy, and so there's no need for it. So I can just make stuff up. So I'm going to try and fight the urge to constantly talk, just because in the end, I think that a lot of what's going on is relatively straightforward. See, if only I had cool music like Neville has in his masterclass. Masterpiece Theater. All right, so again, getting those ridges out of there. Now moving to the inside. So as I work on the inside of the forearm, I'm going to have to do a bit of thinking to figure out, well, I really don't know what the back of this thing's supposed to look like. But as you probably know, it's pretty common for a modeler to be given a design, excuse me, while I drink. Okay. To be given a design that isn't 100% thorough. And so having to fill in the gaps like I'm trying to do in here is a very, very common thing to do. Now, it's one thing, obviously, if it's my own design and easier for me to fill in the gaps. But the point being that one of the biggest assets of a modeler to any company is your ability to fill in those gaps in ways that make sense. And work with the intention of the original design. That by far is one of the most useful skills that a modeler has. If you can show that you can take a very, very detailed design and model, a perfect 3D representation of that 2D design, that's very valuable skill. But also, if you can show that you can take a very rough design where maybe you have a front 3/4 sketch, but no information about what the back of that thing looks like, and that you can make that up in 3D, that's going to be really useful. Because you're going to encounter every possible situation in the workplace. So you're going to encounter situations where your, client or whoever it is going to give you something that's very, very detailed, and you're going to encounter situations where you get the opposite. And so being able to adapt to either of those situations is important. So things have paused, probably just because I forgot to hit pause on my recording. There we go. Probably got a phone call or something. So moving back on. So yeah. So it's an exercise that I often, want to have my students do, which is, to see their ability to handle either situation. Meaning, here's a design that's very detailed. Can you build a model that looks exactly like it? Because if you are given by a client very, very detailed designs for something, meaning you're given front view, side view, top view, 3/4 illustration that's rendered with material indication, you're given all that stuff. They spent the money to do all that because they're expecting that the 3D model is then going to perfectly match all that stuff. And so when that much money is spent on design, it is expected that money was spent because they really wanted to make sure that the design was exactly what they needed for their project. So the 3D artist has to really interpret that perfectly. So that's an important skill set. But then also going to students and saying, okay, well, can you, take something that's a sketch, just something that's relatively rough, because I've also seen, in production, people getting designs from, a client that are literally like, napkin sketches that are supposed to be interpreted into something, which in the end for 3D artists is the, most fun experience to have, because you're being approached to design. That you're not, the difference between designers and 3D artists is not always the same at every workplace. Some places are going to have an art department, and the art department does the design, and they try and minimize the amount of design that the 3D people do. That's going to be common at large shops with bigger budgets that can afford to have an art department. But lots of smaller shops, they really just want 3D artists or effects artists or game artists or whatever, who can design as well. So, that's why our full-time program at Gnomon has a, traditional portfolio requirement to get in, because in the end, your ability to draw and design is critical. Sure, there's a lot of positions for 3D artists where you don't need to be able to do that, but that's not what Gnomon focuses on. Because we focus on not all the sort of technical, obviously we focus on lots of technical stuff, but we don't focus, let's say, on, programming and software development. We focus on the art side of technology and want our students to be artists. Because in the end, that's the aspect to the industry that I'm most interested in. I think it's all cool. Software development and all that stuff are all important, critical, and fascinating parts of our industry. But in the end, I see Gnomon as an art school. So created a mask. In the masking palette, I then said create alpha, so that I could then export that alpha and save this mask. Just useful thing, so I don't have to paint that mask again, since it can be time consuming sometimes to create your masks, and you don't want to have to redo them. So going to lower SDiv level a couple times in there to smooth things out. Now going back in. So in the design, there were definitely some little bumps on the front of his forearm. So I've switched now to the standard brush up here, and using drag rectangle with just a simple alpha. So I can just drag on these little dots. And I started doing that with X symmetry on, but then you can see at this point I turned that off because I felt it was going to just look goofy. It was really symmetrical. Also, I'm doing this on a layer. And so for this was definitely something that I wasn't sure about, as far as if this was the direction I was going to want to go in. So I made a layer, so it'd be easy to turn off or tone down or dial down or get rid of later. The design had just a rough indication of these larger bumps. All the smaller ones I just decided to put in because I felt it made it look a little more interesting. And since I don't have X symmetry on anymore, I have to do it on both sides. But it's going to, in the end, make it feel a little more natural that, it's a large, broad area that we can see potentially from the front. Now I'm, instead of adding, I'm Z subtracting with the same brush. Just thought it maybe would look a little cooler. Oh, it kind of looks like little craters. And there we go. So we've pretty much wrapped up the torso block in. Still a lot of tweaking that'll end up getting done later. And now just moving on to a finger. Something to point out with the fingers. Since The small finger is, as far as the base mesh was concerned, I just took the big finger and copied it and scaled it down a little bit to make the small finger. But once I got into ZBrush, I decided that in the end, since the small finger's on the inside, you won't see it as much, and for the sake of time, I decided I'm just going to detail one finger, and then I'll just use the same normal map on the smaller finger. So you're going to see in ZBrush that I'm never going to go to the other finger, the small one. I'm just going to work on the one finger. And then with this, as with everything else I've done, you can see that my process is pretty much drawing first, creating a little map that tells me where I need to then follow those lines to fill in volume. And then, as with what I've been doing with this finger, I'm trying to do something that's not human. So it has this same general idea of there's skin and tendons in there that need to be able to flex and extend, but at the same time doing something with it that's a little bit funky. And I have to do obviously both sides of the finger because we don't have local symmetry in ZBrush, which would be nice, but not really a big deal for this finger because it's simple. Yeah, here it's really a good example of seeing how using ZBrush sometimes really just feels like drawing. It's using a pen by definition is going to make it feel like drawing, and whether you're on a tablet or a Cintiq, I very much, even though it's, everybody's like, oh, it's digital sculpture. It's like, in a way, but to me, I really feel like I'm using, my sort of drawing sensibility. And so it's almost kind of like what results in sculpting kind of feels like you're shading from a drawing perspective. So I only did the one finger on the left side, so I have to use Smart Resim to mirror that to the other side. Save it out. And then, all right, we just got to the end of that clip, so let's move on. All right. So now, moving on to the waist. So now, there we go. I actually saw it for a second. So that is always up on my other monitor. So I would, it might make it more interesting for you to actually try and have that up as you're watching this. And so that's something that, I just had it up for a second, so you can always pause the video and just screen grab it so you can refer to that. Because what I'm doing right now is purely based on that design. So I'm first drawing, right? Every now and then you'll see I turn the topology on, just the polyframe, just so I can, try and take advantage of my flow of actual geometry. And then what I'm doing inside here is purely based on drawing, based on looking at the design and making sure that what I, the guidelines, my map, is accurate. And I find that, once I have this sort of map drawn onto the model in ZBrush, that things get a lot easier. The tricky part is, since I don't have a front view, side view, or front view, top view, bottom view of this guy, there's lots of things that I have to make up, and so that requires a little bit more thinking in ZBrush. So that's where things sort of sometimes slow down a little bit, because you have to sort of sit and figure out, the front of that shoulder there. I can't see that in the design, so I have to now start figuring out, well, what is this thing? Because he's got this reversed torso down here. Because he's got, his torso up above is sort of facing the right direction, but now we have got something that's like his pelvis is flipped backwards, His torso, though, it's like, well, the arm is flipped backwards, but it's facing forward. So are we looking at a back or are we looking at a chest right there? That's the thing I have to kind of play with. Because that top area right there, like, is this a back or is this a chest? Well, if this is the arm and that's a bicep, then technically this is a chest on the top. And this back here is a back. But I don't want to make it literally look at chest or literally look like a back, because that's just going to be stupid or boring. It'll be too human. So again, it's like to have it just look like you sort of cookie cutter took human parts and recombined them together, and every part looks completely human. I don't think is as interesting, because the design that I'm using for, the thing with this workshop is that it's on creature development, and I only have this one creature to use as an example for you guys, just because any other stuff that I've done over the last couple of years I can't show. So I had to make something, and had to make just one thing to use as an example. So this one example is meant to stand in for a bunch of other things. So, it's like whether this is a, normal quadrupedal forest dweller creature, or whether it's some weird slug creature, whether it's a demon or an orc or a troll or a goblin or a whatever, everything applies in the sense that, unless you're doing a human, unless you're working on sports titles or World War II titles or things that, require humans, or obviously fantasy stuff that has humans too. But my point being that humans need to look human, but any kind of creature, demon, monster, whatever, you can kind of do whatever you want. And when you look at the stuff that's in, games like, Gears of War, or Unreal Tournament, or, like the stuff that Epic does, or just, creatures in all sorts of different games and film, there's no reason for the anatomy on them to be literal to any specific kind of animal. It's just this weird rehash. And so, yeah, I mean, if you have something like an orc, why does the orc's chest, have to have the same number of, muscle groups, or why does the sternum have to be the same shape? And when you see stuff that, as in movies or Lord of the Rings with the orcs inside there, it's all warped in some weird way. There's something different about the anatomy. All the really cool creatures in Hellboy. So I refer to all of this, I'm referring to different games or movies or stuff just to point out that, I'm a fan of a lot of different stuff. And it's when I see those things that I realize that I need to keep making stuff. So you can see how pretty quickly our map lines are starting to turn into forms. So here, having to sort of invent, is it a back, is it a chest? It's neither. So it's sort of starting with some, sort of lack of logic. And then this is slowly just going to get resolved, because we can see, like, here we have a shoulder, but since that's like the front of this arm, then this kind of needs to be a pectoral muscle in here. So as I'm working on this, I'm trying to resolve, well, how do we go from lower back into chest? Because this is like a back chest combo. So I'm trying to merge a back into a chest right now. So it requires a little bit of tweaking. And then looking at it from a bunch of different angles. And so this is definitely an angle that started to help me realize what I was dealing with. that I am dealing with a back merging into a chest that has a back on the back, and you know. And so by working on the model, looking at it from a completely different angle, definitely helped me sort of realize what I might, you know, need to do. Also, you'll notice that a lot of the sculpting I do with the clay tubes brush is that I'm not actually sculpting uh, with the form, like along it. And so like in an area like this, I'm not sculpting the, like in an area, I'm not sculpting sort of along the form. I'm sculpting perpendicular to it. So like when I'm sketching or drawing, like to build up form quickly, you'll see that I'm drawing with the flow of that shape. But when I start wanting to sort of tune the shape, I'm sort of sculpting almost like I'm cross-hatching. And I think that that just comes from the fact that I have, more of a background drawing than sculpting. And so I approach this stuff as if I'm drawing. So here's where I'm now having to sort of deal with the map for this back, but wanting it not to look literally like a back. So I'm now doing this kind of like back chest combinations. We have like a pectoral muscle as well as a lat muscle on the same side of the body, but wanting to not make it, too literal. So I'm trying to just sort of still have this sort of feeling of this, is it a pelvis or is it another extension of a collarbone or clavicle? Because technically, since this is the back of the arm here, then it would need to have a shoulder blade. Point being, it's kind of random and kind of on purpose. There's definitely a thought process to it. And then often I'll end up, doing something that needs to get erased or removed. Sometimes not, but, in the end, later on, we'll see that those little bumps that I put inside there ended up bugging me later. So now dealing with our little arm. So this is the second arm we're dealing with. We did the first one up above, and now I've got this one. That's going to be the same general idea, so pretty literal on this guy. Literal meaning humanish. So you can see that I'm relatively patient in the sense that like I spend a lot of time very slowly building up the form with the clay tubes brush, which is not necessarily a good thing. It's just sort of my habit. So, while, I didn't, I spent probably, like I said earlier, a couple days working on this guy, there are people out there that could, pull off an even more finished model in less time. And that's just because they are much bolder with their strokes. Um, I think that that comes from practice. So it's definitely something that I hope to be able to do eventually. So, being able to finish a character model in a couple days is still, decent speed. Um, so, like, I don't think that I'm slow, but um, I just know when I, hear of people like, Colby Jukes, who, comes to Noman last year and does a class on character modeling, and on the airplane modeled this, Ninja Turtle that was totally rad. And, just modeled it on his laptop in just a few hours, and it looked completely, like a finished model. Um, he's just really, really, really fast. And so then you start to wonder, like, well, what makes him so fast? Alvaro is another person, who's doing one of the master classes, who's amazingly talented and really, really fast. And it just comes from practice, and then the more comfortable they get with the tool, the faster they can work. And so I think that that's something that, one of my motivations, obviously, of organizing the master classes was to be able to, watch amazing people work. I'm just as much a student as anybody else. And so, by being able to watch Neville work and watch Alvaro work and Martin and all these amazing people, then there's just always going to be more stuff to pick up, and there's always going to be more stuff to learn. And I just, can't wait to be able to watch what they've done so that I can hopefully pick up some, techniques that help me get faster. And the reason that I want to get faster in the end has to do not just with work-related reasons, it has to do with wanting to have more fun. Faster you work, the more fun you have. That's just, if there's any good example of the effect of speed on fun, it's ZBrush. Before ZBrush, used to spend forever making character models with NURBS and patch models, and, a single character would have, 800 patches that took you like, weeks to deal with, positional and tangential continuity between all of the patches and stitch nodes and all this technical crap that we had to go through, years ago with Power Animator and with Maya as well. And, before polys and subdivision surfaces and all this kind of stuff became big, back in like 99. So before that, things were just painfully slow to do. And then, and then ZBrush comes along, and all of a sudden you can like do stuff so quickly. And so it went from being weeks to, to a week to now you can do cool things in a day. And then the funny thing is like, okay, well, it's definitely way more fun now than it used to be. But now imagine if you could do something as good as you could do in a couple days in just one day, how much more fun it would be. So I purely see the speed thing as the faster you are, the more fun you're having. The more you can create in less time, the more rewarding it is. And then you get rewarded for that speed, because if you are faster, you're more valuable to production. So not only are you having more fun, but you're also getting more opportunities. I hope it's okay that I'm rambling about all sorts of different stuff, because in the end, if I can't really just continue to talk purely about what's going on screen. Because you can see it's more of the same. It's just... and I was going to do a lot of skipping through this. I'm eventually probably going to start doing that, but I think it's useful to watch, because I think the main thing that, at least for any students that are watching, it's like you just have to notice that there's, a logic to what goes on. There's a thought process to what goes on, and there's a lot of patience. And then at the same time, with the, logic, hopefully it's very clear that you should not allow yourself to end up in a position where you don't know what you're doing, and then not immediately jump to doing something about it that'll help you figure that out. Meaning looking at reference. So if I get stuck on an area, I'm perfectly happy to, look at my, Eckershey male sculpt from Anatomy Tools, because things are rather complicated when it comes to anatomy. I don't know one professional who doesn't use reference. So, I mean, that's been an interesting thing that I've learned over the years with Gnomon and from DVDs and classes and, hanging out with lots of amazingly talented artists, that, it doesn't really matter who you are. Everybody is very quick to admit that there's gaps in their knowledge and that they have to use reference to fill those gaps all the time. But the moment you use reference, you're now absorbing new material. You are learning. You are not cheating. Because there's obviously a big difference between reference and plagiarism. Because if you're just looking at, a photo of an arm to get reference for anatomy, you're not plagiarizing. It's like, what are you plagiarizing? You're plagiarizing nature? That's just silly. Because there's design, meaning something that's man-made, and then there's nature. Any reference you're using for examples of nature are fine. And then as far as man-made stuff, that's where you just have to be careful, obviously. So something that I've never done, for example, like I've never sat and looked at somebody else's design, whether it's a Carlos design or a, whatever, and tried to just, copy it directly. Because that would just, again, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not into looking at things and just copying them. But definitely if it's somebody else's style, you want to develop your own style. So I'm more into using reference by looking at photographs of real things and trying to pick up off that. But the master study stuff can be useful too. Everything's useful in the end. As long as you learn something you didn't know an hour before. You're perfectly welcome to just turn off the audio and just put on some music. As I drink my coffee. Oh, there you go. Had to change that. So just trying to resolve how those shapes push into each other. Checking the poly frame just to see where my edge flow is. And moving on into the leg. So the leg sort of posed an interesting issue here, because since he only has a single leg, rear leg, he doesn't have two. Obviously, if you think of something like a human leg, the outside and the inside, the outer thigh and the inner thigh are very different from each other as far as the muscle groups go and the tendons and the function. But since he has a single leg, it's kind of assumed that what's on the outside, on either side, the left and right side of his single thigh, would probably be identical, because if it wasn't, that would mean that it moves differently when it moves in one direction as it does in the other. And so that's one thing that I sort of had to contend with a little bit. It was like, well, if it's going to have to be the same on both sides, it still has to be interesting. Here I'm working on an area that you're probably never going to see because it's going to get hidden by his rear leg. But I figured, well, might as well have something in there. So clearly a sort of invented kneecap shape. Trying to round that out a little bit. And then just add a little bit of volume. And a little bit of folding. And then now I'm going to start getting into an area that's not in the design. The design from the side view had a very crude representation of those little shapes that I'm putting inside there. But as far as what they look like on the back side, at this point now, it's these moments that are the fun moments, because these are the moments where I get to, in ZBrush, get back into like, get to have to figure something out. So, and this ended up going in a direction that I didn't expect. When I started the sculpt, but in the end, worked out okay. It's a bunch of happy little hearts. So, looking at it from a bunch of angles, just to see if that's okay. And we hit the end of that clip. But yeah, what we can see here on the side, like that's in the sketch, the original sketch. But again, figuring out the back side there, the top of the thigh, a lot to figure out there. So let's take a look at the next clip.